In his past life, he studied until the day he died, a perfect student who never lived and achieved nothing. Reborn in a world of swords and sorcery, Alan swore he'd live differently this time. No grades, no pressure, no rules. But in a society where knowledge is power, even freedom makes him a prodigy. He just wanted a simple, carefree life, but the world won't let genius rest. Can a scholar's mind survive a wanderer's heart? Let's find out. This story begins with the protagonist, Alan Rowan, the Duke's third son, thinking about swords, magic, and the magical world he loved so much in his past life. At that moment, he was called by Shord Vinforce, who acted as butler and tutor in the protagonist's father's house. The teacher told young Master Alan not to get distracted. Only a month remained until the exam. MC thought, this is not how he imagined it. In the kingdom of Yulgria, in the Dragoon region, was his father's duchy. The protagonist was sitting on the shore, fishing in Meganabashi. He felt the line tighten and the rod was pulled downward. The protagonist deftly hooked the line and pulled the fish ashore. Alan joyfully exclaimed that this was simply magnificent. Throwing another catch into a basket full of fish, he cast the rod back into the pond. At that moment, MC heard Reyna, the baker's daughter, exclaim, addressing him as Lord. Amazing as always, she added. His magic control is simply amazing. Alan replied, don't address him as Lord, it doesn't suit her. She made the delivery? The girl replied that she did, adding, but they're only 12. She couldn't address him, a lord's son, in such a familiar manner. It was disrespectful. The protagonist turned to her and asked her sarcastically, disrespectful, she says? But bathing in her underwear in front of him wasn't disrespectful. Reyna irritably asked him, when did that happen? The protagonist tactfully remained silent. She asked him, did he skip class again? Mr. Shord was looking for him. The protagonist muttered in response, he doesn't want to study all the time. He should have been born a peasant. Reyna responded with surprise, that's not right. After all, he has every right to enroll in the state academy, where students from all over the kingdom gather. MC replied thoughtfully, he has no rights whatsoever. He's no different from anyone else. He's not that noble, so she shouldn't think about it. At that moment, he deftly reeled in another catch. Reyna was amazed. This was simply amazing. Game genius. That would be a title he'd be more interested in, right? The protagonist looked at her and remarked that if he entered the academy, she'd be very happy and leave him alone, right? The girl looked at him in bewilderment and said, of course, she will be happy about this. It would make the whole city proud. Just imagine, Alan Rowan, who'd enrolled in the academy, was her childhood friend. Reyna chuckled and continued, she'll pass this on to her grandchildren. Maybe she'll even tell them that she was his, the protagonist's, nanny. So that's right, she'll be very happy. He told her that he'll try. The protagonist handed her a basket of fish and thought, really, he knew he had to try harder. He was ready to beg anyone, just to be taught. He was ready to try any way to learn. 4 hours later, in the mansion, sitting in a chair, the protagonist thought about when he was reborn and came to his senses. He was very surprised. But that's not what he needs to think about now. To pass the academic entrance exam, he must study day after day under the weight of stress. He won't help himself with the last memories of his past life, or something like that. There is nothing more important in the world than education. In his past life, he spent his entire youth fulfilling a promise to his parents. It was difficult for him. He studied 18 hours a day throughout each year. But even then, he couldn't get into the capital's university. Then he went to a private university. He studied diligently at university and managed to get a job at a large company. They demanded communication skills, analytical skills, even skills unrelated to business and work. He was bad at everything. His boss was always criticizing him, asking him to be more serious. Then he came across a fantasy novel online. Stories about reincarnation in another world were very popular at the time. He suddenly felt the urge to read. But now, as much as he hated to say it, learning is a true talent. Suddenly, he realized he seemed to have relaxed too much. Shord snapped. He hadn't called for a break. The teacher shook him so hard that the ink pen flew out of his mouth. The tutor continued. The exam will be a turning point in his life. Let him be more serious. Entry into the academy has been the Rowan family's main desire for the past 7 centuries, and a great future is finally at hand. If his job were to oppress, shame, and disappoint his family, he wouldn't be educating him. The protagonist addressed him as if he were his grandfather and apologized. He added, he was simply reflecting. He could certainly be more serious. Shord suggested he continue his studies. If he only understood this, then everything would be fine. Then they would continue. The protagonist thought he understood his concerns. His answer was unlike his usual self. He, as the youngest member of the family, had been a complete idiot 3 minutes ago, a spoiled and smug child. As soon as he remembered his past life, his dislike of studying seemed to disappear. It seemed to him that he hadn't simply played around, but had become a mixture of Alan and his former self. What would happen when a simpleton mixed with a nerd? After a while, distracted from his studies again, he thought, that's why the hierarchy of the aristocracy in this country includes dukes, marquises, counts, viscounts, and barons. So there are a lot of noble families, and there are also a lot of simpletons from ordinary families. What differentiated them wasn't what you might immediately think. The country even has something like kindergartens, and as children grow up, they go to high school. The education rate here is very high because even ordinary people study hard, like Reyna, for example. In short, education and knowledge are of great importance here. Nothing is more important than that, or so it seems. Even though he was the Duke's third son, with his education, he wasn't much different from a commoner. And even though he had finally been reborn into a world of swords and magic, it turned out to be familiar society. He was brought out of his thoughts by the stern voice of the teacher, who was saying something about reforms. The protagonist felt very awkward in front of him. Shord leaned over him and asked him, "He's lost in thought again, right?" he said, more irritably. He can't fool him. Why is he so careless about his studies? The protagonist asked him to calm down. He had been listening and taking notes. He showed the tutor a sheet of paper that, indeed, had the necessary notes. MC noted that he even retained the reflex of writing down everything he heard. He was responsible for recording all the information from meetings at his previous job. While the teacher was checking his notes, Alan told him he could point out any mistakes. Shord, unexpectedly for the protagonist, covered his face with his hand and exclaimed in a trembling voice that he, his student, had finally heard him. Tears welled up in the butler's eyes. He said that what he was about to tell his student next would not please him, but they needed to continue at the same pace. He absolutely had to lead him to success. And so, he had created a plan for absolute success. Shord showed him a board that outlined the protagonist's entire day. MC carefully read the schedule. From 8 to 9 in the morning, he had breakfast, and from 9 to 10:30, literature. Then came a break. From 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., there was supposed to be physical education and theory of magic, with lunch from 12:30 p.m. to 1:30 p.m. After lunch, there was a nap. Then, from 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m., history and geopolitics, followed by a break, and the school day ended with strategy and politics from 4:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. Alan thought in surprise, too few assignments, and was there even a nap? The teacher said his practical skills were quite good, so they only needed to focus on theory. Suddenly, the protagonist asked him to change the schedule. Shord objected, saying that if there was more rest, he wouldn't have time for anything. The protagonist replied that that wasn't what he was talking about. Let the classes last 19 hours instead of 8. Let him remove the nap hour and breaks from the schedule and reduce the lunchtime to 15 minutes. Alan thought, although this wasn't strict enough, while he needed to get used to it, he wanted to make sure he didn't miss any important events and learn what this exam was all about. Shord said, puzzled. He was glad for his enthusiasm, but it was important to maintain it, otherwise he'd tire out right away. MC understood the teacher was right, but that only applied to his past. He resolutely declared, "Don't let the teacher worry." He carried the Rowan family's undying desire to gain knowledge on his shoulders. He wouldn't allow himself to rest. The tutor looked at him in amazement and remarked that he'd never thought he'd hear those words from him. He seemed serious. The protagonist asked him if he understood now. Shord told him that was true. He promised him that breaks between lectures would be reduced to 10 minutes. Lunch was important, but he was willing to completely eliminate the hour-long nap. There was nothing more to regret. Alan asked him why he needed an hour-long lunch. Even if he just had a sandwich, 15 minutes would be too much. The teacher was completely shocked by his words. He exclaimed, "Such food is completely unacceptable for a nobleman." The protagonist vehemently objected. It was completely unacceptable not to enroll in the academy, and his noble status wouldn't matter. Shord tried to object, but the protagonist interrupted him, saying, "He's too protective. If he can become a knight, he'll spend the night in camps. He thinks there will be hot meals there. The academy is just one point. What comes after is more important. It's a battlefield. The enemies are strong, but there's only one way to defeat them." He's firmly resolved that, from today on, his entire lunch will consist of battle rations, and he won't tolerate any objections. Shord stood there, as if he couldn't believe his ears. Then the tutor, amazed, said he understood everything. He added, "Even though he interrupted every lesson in the past, it seems this trait of his won't get in the way anymore?" MC asked him, "Enough. He cared too much for a simple tutor. Let him think about himself." Shord started getting angry. Alan wondered, perplexed, had he crossed the line? After a while, it was snack time. The teacher was sitting next to the protagonist, also devouring a sandwich. The protagonist told him he didn't have to sit with him. He knew that, right? He should ask the cook for a proper snack. The tutor said pompously, "He refuses that. Aren't they on a battlefield? You can't sympathize with others." Alan said he was doing his homework. Let the teacher at least go to the restroom. Shord, wiping his mouth with a napkin, replied that he was refusing that too. He had everything planned out, so Alan shouldn't worry about it. He'd be fine in any situation. MC was very surprised by what he said. A few days later, early in the morning, the protagonist was going for a morning jog. He ran and thought, before his reincarnation, he hadn't exercised. But now he realized how important it was. It was even fun, repeating simple commands. So, he began developing his physical abilities and practicing swordsmanship in the mornings. With the exam approaching, he needed to be a total nerd. Would that be how he'd get into the academy? While training with the sword, the protagonist noted that the chance of passing the test was 10%. He'd be lying to himself if he said he wasn't interested. But even if he passed, what would happen next? Would he have to keep studying to find a job? At that moment, Reina approached him and started calling his name, but the protagonist didn't hear her right away. He was completely immersed in his sword training. When the girl called out loudly, he flinched in surprise and told her she'd scared him. Reina, in her defense, told him she'd been calling him so much, he was working so hard. She looked at him carefully and said, "Is it just her, or is it like he's a completely different person?" He was surprised, was he? The girl said, "That's right. He's been training with the sword for so long." The protagonist answered her with some sadness. He simply does what he must do, what he wants to do. He thought, he died at 36 years old due to illness. On his last day, he thought about the clouds. He looked out the window at the sky and thought about the clouds. The wind carried them forward. It would have been better if in his past life, he had done what he wanted. After thinking a little more, he turned to the girl and told her that it was so. He had decided everything for himself. Reina looked at him in bewilderment. The protagonist continued, "There are swords and magic in this world. It is so wide and new for him. He will do what he wants. He will definitely live this life as the wind tells him." The girl thought perplexedly. "In this life?" She exclaimed in surprise and asked him, "Is he refusing to take the exam?" Alan answered her, "That is not true. He will definitely not give up." He thought that if he wants to learn more about this world, he should enroll in the academy, but if necessary, he'll drop out. The protagonist told Reina he'd be fine with anything, but he'd do anything to live happily because he didn't want to have any more regrets. Reina didn't understand what was happening to him. She didn't recognize him. MC asked her if she'd be happy and leave him alone if he entered the academy. Desperate, the girl apologized and honestly told him she'd be lonely. If he entered the academy, he might become a completely different person. The protagonist chuckled and said, "Don't worry, he's not that pathetic." Reina smiled and remarked just as she'd thought, "It's him. He'll definitely get in. He'll be famous not only in Dragoon, but throughout the country. So let him study, work hard, and never forget her." The protagonist gripped his sword hilt tighter and said, "Well, he'll get to work and prove himself." Meanwhile, in the capital of Dragoon, Dragride, the mistress of the Dragoon house, Maria Dragoon, was sorting through forms and data. She exclaimed irritably, "I can't expect anything from them. Only one child was even remotely interesting." She turned to her granddaughter, Fyun, and told her to listen carefully. Of those from their region who were applying to the academy, how many would be admitted to Class A? This would determine the balance of power between the regions. The youngest son, Sideswinger, he certainly wouldn't lose to the daughter of the vile Reverence. Even by the standards of the Dragoon family, her talent was impressive. She has a 99% chance of being admitted, and she wouldn't even dare be admitted to any class other than Class A. Maria looked closely at Fyun and asked if she understood her. The girl replied with a smile that, of course, she understood everything she said. The woman pulled out one of the forms, read it, and asked her granddaughter to report to her about Alan. The granddaughter replied that he was ranked at the bottom, although he could pass the magic exam. His grades were terrible, so it was unlikely he would pass. His physical abilities were unknown. At this time, Reina sat under a tree, watching Alan train. Later, the one who would leave their name in the history of their kingdom would be the protagonist. No one noticed his talent, except for one girl. The protagonist turned to the girl and asked her how to use magic. MC's words caught her off guard. She was lost in thought. 2 months had passed since receiving the memories of his past life and deciding to start anew. Another month remained until the entrance exam. The result was that the protagonist's character and thought patterns had changed. He did not receive any special powers after reincarnation. The fresh mind of a 12-year-old boy retained the experience of a 36-year-old man, and all of this combined in a single life. The protagonist used this for 2 months, working diligently, but no matter what he did, he realized he had no talent for magic. Or was he mispronouncing the spells? He was only able to use body-enhancing magic, but everyone in the world was capable of the same. Alan knew that body-enhancing magic consisted of 2 elements: magical power and manipulation. Depending on the capacity and fullness of one's magic, on average, people began using magic at the age of 12. Fullness of magic can be improved through training, but its capacity is an innate talent. MC, by the way, had around 2,000, which is 20 times higher than average. However, fullness of magic increases it by 1.2 times, so his maximum was 2,400. Those entering the academy have roughly the same values. The minimum passing value is 1,000. Every year, places were filled by people with values of 10,000. On the one hand, this magic itself was difficult to grasp. He only knew in words that his perception of it was high. Even his swordsmanship instructor told him he had nothing more to teach him. Elemental magic stood in the protagonist's way. The ability to use fire, water, or lightning, what he had been waiting for in this world. But all his subsequent attempts were still fruitless. So it was all a matter of talent, he thought. He felt hurt. Why should he live in such a world without magical abilities? He, too, wanted to be really cool. Reina, who had been watching his training, asked him what a fireball was. The protagonist flinched at her unexpected appearance and grumbled at her not to frighten him like that. He added that he was the master's son, and she knew it, so she should address him as master. The girl laughed and told him she didn't want to do that. She wasn't here long, so there was no need. The protagonist sighed in irritation. Sometime later, Shord reported to Bellwood, the head of the Rowan household and the protagonist's father, about his progress. The tutor said that it wouldn't be possible to fail the exam by accident. Those who take it prepare for a long time. What pleased him was that the protagonist had changed a lot. He was very surprised when Alan decided to increase the study time. But what surprised him even more was that MC first collected all the questions from previous exams and memorized them. He said that to understand his own strength and get closer to his goal, he must adhere to this strategy. For several days, he analyzed the questions and prepared this very strategy. Shord added that he had taken all his work and he realized that he had failed as a tutor. But he didn't consider this something terrible. If Alan had a question in the middle of class, he wouldn't rest until he had an answer. And instead of just a simple lesson, it becomes a full-fledged discussion. The teacher added, watching the protagonist practicing swordsmanship in the courtyard, that over the past 2 months, his student had become a completely different person. He'd worked harder than ever before. Shord concluded that in this state, their young master had a chance to enter the academy. He, as his tutor, guaranteed it. Bellwood remarked in surprise. So, while they were in the capital on business, Alan had been studying the whole time, only before the exam, only in these 2 months. The protagonist's father dropped his head exhausted into his hands and buried his face in the table. Bellwood's eldest son looked at his father and asked the teacher in surprise, "Is he sure about this? Perhaps he'd confused him with Roselia?" Bellwood immediately raised his head and hopefully said, "Yes, it must be her." Then everything was clear to him. The head of the house laughed and asked Shord, "He's probably getting old, huh?" The teacher disliked this attitude and glared at Rowan's family, who clearly sensed the tension in the air. Shord spoke clearly and deliberately. His student, Alan, had labored for 2 months without rest or adequate food. The young master had expressed his desires. His hard work would definitely count for something on the exam. The teacher added that they should both imagine the protagonist trying to enjoy his studies in the new world without rest or food. He glared so menacingly at his student's relatives that Grimm became embarrassed and told his father that the news was generally good. He offered to speak with his younger brother in person during lunch. Grimm leaned toward his father's ear and whispered that, judging by the teacher's words, they had better not pressure Alan. Bellwood agreed with his eldest son. After a while, the protagonist entered the dining hall. He joyfully greeted his father and brother. MC apologized for being late, but explained that he was discussing the history of magic with his teacher. Bellwood and Grimm looked at him in surprise. Then his father said it was fine. He was busy. They understood. The protagonist thanked them for their understanding. Sitting down at the table, the protagonist asked them if he understood correctly that Mom was still in the capital. His father, surprised, replied that she was, looking after Roselia. Alan laughed kindly and remarked that she was always so caring. Grimm and Bellwood looked at each other in confusion. Then the father turned to MC and told him that they were tired of formal conversations and that he could speak as usual. Grimm winked at him conspiratorially and added that Mom wasn't here either. The protagonist thought for a minute, then smiled broadly, spread his arms, and simply congratulated his father and brother on their return. Bellwood and Grimm exchanged glances. MC was a little worried about acting like Alan without raising suspicion, but there was no need. The father and sons began eating. After a while, Bellwood, wiping his mouth after eating, turned to the protagonist and asked him how he was going with his exam preparation. The protagonist thought, now I understand. It was strange that they hadn't asked about this before. Were they worried too? He needed to be more careful. He told them he thought he was doing well. His father remarked with surprise, "Is that so?" Shord spoke of him with enviable confidence. Alan said, "That's true. To be honest, everything is going according to plan. Considering his teacher's age, he is grateful for his work." After his words, Bellwood and Grimm stared at him in amazement. Recovering from his surprise, Grimm turned to his father and told him that his mischievous younger brother had finally come to his senses. He was on his own now. Bellwood, still stunned, was forced to admit it. He added, they should have faith in him. MC devoured the dinner dishes with a satisfied expression. Bellwood, downing another glass of wine, said warily that Viscount Moonlit was giving him no peace at all. Rumor had it that his son had even boasted about his intelligence during the meeting. How dare he, when their Alan was so much smarter than him? The protagonist thought wryly, what an old scoundrel. If he weren't such a drinker, he'd be a wonderful father. The next day, Reina watched the protagonist's training again. He activated his body enhancement, and a bright glow formed around him. The girl exclaimed in surprise, "Wow!" MC, concentrating, thought that to use such magic, there were 2 necessary techniques. The first was the circulation of body magic. Manipulating body magic was his specialty. Others were able to create ice and fire with their magic. Alan tried to activate his nature reform, but unfortunately, it didn't work. He knew he lacked talent. His nature reform skill hadn't changed since he was 12, meaning he was unlikely to be able to use such magic. The protagonist lay down on the ground and thought, if he gets into the academy, he'll be able to find a tutor in this field, and for that, he'll definitely pass the exam. As if to confirm his words, he raised his fist in the air. Reina, surprised, told him she thought he was joking when he declared his desire to use elemental magic, but he works so hard, and she thinks he'll succeed. The protagonist, rising from the ground, replied, he said he could do it. The girl mused, wondering what he'll achieve in the outside world. She couldn't even imagine it. MC began training again, and then the day arrived for him to leave for the capital. Reina brought him provisions for the journey, for which he was very grateful. Then the protagonist shook his teacher's hand firmly, like a man, and Shord's eyes filled with tears. Alan looked at him heartfeltly. Finally, the protagonist set off. 2 more weeks remained until the exam. Upon reaching the city, the protagonist met Dio, a Class C researcher. The protagonist bowed politely, told him his name, and declared that he very much wanted to travel with him. The young man, looking at him in surprise, declared that he was his escort. Dio thought, it turns out he wasn't as impudent as he'd heard. MC thought with a smile, the Duke's famously impudent third son bowing to an escort, asking for a ride to Dragride. Another week, just a little while longer until the exam. Reaching the capital requires 12 days, including a transfer in this city. And from there, it's 1.5 days to reach the capital of Runerelia on the magic train. The main character needed an escort because of Lady Cecilia. He called Dio to allow her to remain in the capital. If not, who else could accompany him? MC hadn't miscalculated. Along the way, they encountered a D-rank monster, a red spider, which Dio dispatched with remarkable skill and speed. The delighted protagonist exclaimed, "This is simply amazing." He asked the guy if he could spar with him a few times with spears. Dio answered calmly, "I'm on a mission." The protagonist didn't back down. Perhaps they could take a break then? He begged him very much. He wanted to fight a spearman. Dio, removing his helmet, said, "Just this once. He's not allowed to do that." Alan thanked him with a smile, which only further perplexed Dio. Having sparred with MC, the spearman knew the range of a spear was completely different from that of a sword. An untrained man couldn't stand against him. They engaged in sparring at every stop, and one day during practice, Dio tripped him and thought he'd defeat him without mercy. And he wasn't holding a spear, just a simple pole. Looking at the fallen MC, Dio thought he'd shut up now, but he was surprised to see Alan keep getting back on his feet, no matter how many times he fell. Continuing the fight during the breaks, Dio noted that the young master's tactics confirmed he'd been studying something important before the exam, practicing swordsmanship in the mornings. He also ran every day. The last time he'd seen Alan before, he'd been reading a book. Dio wondered where the rumors of his shamelessness had come from. After all, he'd continued to do so right up until Dragride. Upon arriving, the protagonist respectfully addressed Dio and thanked him for everything. He added that he had learned a lot from him, although he hadn't been able to defeat him. The spearman thought in amazement, right, he had intended to defeat him. Was that serious? Dio realized the protagonist would definitely become a strongman. He answered the protagonist out loud that he hadn't done anything great for him. Alan said with a smile that he would definitely repay him. They'll see each other again. As MC was about to leave, Dio called out to him, intending to say something. But when the protagonist turned around, the boy became embarrassed and simply wished him luck on the exam. He thought maybe he should go study too? Sometime later, the protagonist entered Dragoon County, in the city of Dragride. It was already quite late, so he decided to take the magic train. Entering the compartment, the protagonist was pleasantly surprised by the interior. It was a comfortably furnished single compartment. He thought, even though the exam was coming up, he couldn't help but be happy about it. After studying for a bit, MC went to bed, and upon waking, he took up his studies again. He wanted to train, but when he peered out into the corridor, the protagonist saw several people and hesitated to do so. A little later, the waiter brought him food. The protagonist ate, and then settled down to study again until evening. When the train corridor was empty, he went to the freight platform and began sword training. While studying, he didn't even notice how morning had arrived. MC cursed. He needed to be there by 10 in the morning, and he also needed to sleep to prepare. At that moment, he heard Fyun tell him he was interesting. Alan turned around in amazement and saw a giggling girl watching him. MC thought he'd sensed someone's presence last night, but he didn't think it had been real for the entire 6 hours. She was kind of weird, he noted silently. The protagonist decided to ignore her, but the girl suddenly told him her name, adding that she was the heir to the Dragoon family. The protagonist dramatically fell to his knees, bowed, and exclaimed ironically, "Wow, what a surprise!" The daughter of the Dragoon family herself. He begged her forgiveness for his behavior and told her his name. Looking at her from under his brows, unnoticed by her, he thought, of all possible people, she even added a significant prefix to her name. Is she studying him? He raised his head, still kneeling, and with a stupid expression said, "It must be his destiny to meet her here. Maybe they'll even get acquainted?" He thought, well, how about it? She's probably worn out by guys like that, so she should get out of here. But Fyun suddenly laughed and remarked, "He really is interesting," she added. She just thought he was the brother of the great Roselia Rowan. When she saw him before, he was always busy. She was interested in him, as he had already realized. The girl continued, they were both about to take the exam, so they really should get to know each other. The protagonist couldn't hide his irritated look. Fyun asked him, he was hoping to get the hang of magic now, right? Right before the exam, as she could see he was practicing a lot for his future, right? MC thought in surprise. She noticed so much? Are everyone at the academy such monsters as she? He bowed to her again and said he was ashamed, but his magic could barely be considered minimal. That's why he tries to conserve as much mana as possible. That's true, she exclaimed in surprise. Right? Doesn't he have about 2,480? Alan exclaimed in amazement. What? The girl told him not to be surprised. Fyun held something resembling a video camera in her hands. She told him it was a magical device she invented for viewing other people's magic. She hopes to become an engineer. The MC asked her in surprise, does she know his sister? The girl answered, well, of course, she's a zealous rose, right? The protagonist wondered, did his sister do something? Fyun continued, as a future engineer, she was really hoping to meet her. Will he introduce them? The protagonist exclaimed, of course he will. She probably would be glad to meet her. Then he said, he urgently needs to go to the restroom. He needs to leave immediately. The girl chuckled and wished him luck. She added, after all, he'd been training non-stop for 6 hours. It's time to remember that. And also, since they were friends now, he shouldn't call her mistress. The girl wished him luck again with a smile, and as she left, she said, by the way, come to think of it, a nobleman shouldn't bow down without reason. He knows that, right? Only sinners do that. Laughing, Fyun left him. Alan, still kneeling, thought about sinners. His father had apologized to his mother like that, and what had he done? When Fyun entered the carriage, her maid, Sarah, met her and told her she was glad her mistress was okay. The girl apologized for worrying her, but she had things to do. The maid chuckled. Again? If he found out about her, he would surely regret it. The girl chuckled and answered her. She had already introduced herself to him. He made displeased faces, and she was forced to reveal herself. In the end, according to him, he went to the restroom. Sarah exclaimed irritably. Where had he gone? He even had the right to speak to his mistress. Fyun said she felt as if she had to have him at any cost. She asked the maid if she knew anything about him. Sarah looked at his file and said, his chances of passing or failing are low. His grades are pretty bad. It's unlikely he'll pass. Fyun exclaimed. Grades, right? She thought they'd meet again soon. Meanwhile, the protagonist thought about his family. His father had a first son, a second son, a first daughter, and a third son. Him, Alan. Grim, who had completed the official course at the Noble Dragride School. Beck, the second son, who had completed his knightly training and was currently serving in the Dragoon army. It seemed that Grim, as the first son, was destined to become the next head of the family, and Beck was supposed to assist him. His sister, Roselia, who had graduated with honors from the magic department and was 4 years his senior, was also a student. Unlike him, no one doubted her chances of admission. Everyone was confident, but unfortunately, the required minimum mana was higher that year, so she couldn't get in. She was currently studying at the capital's magical institute, studying magical devices. She simply adored him when she was home. So sweet yet silly. Because his sister sent him too many letters, their parents restricted her and allowed her to send no more than 3 pages a month. As a result, she wrote in such tiny font that he couldn't even make out the letters under a magnifying glass. It reminded him of ancient writing. Sometime later, the protagonist got off at the central station in Runerelia. Suddenly, he heard someone call his name. Turning around, he saw Roselia waving at him, shouting over the noise for him to come here. To her, MC was surprised. Sister? What a surprise for him. He thought she wouldn't dress so nicely. She attracted so much attention. Approaching her, Alan remarked, she looked great. Roselia giggled and thanked him, adding that he had changed too. At that moment, Cecilia Rowan's voice rang out. She asked her daughter if she wasn't happy to see him. It hadn't taken her so long to get ready. Roselia obstinately asked her what the point was. Alan called out to his mother and remarked that they hadn't seen each other in a while. The woman, leaning on her sword, said with a smile that she barely recognized him. Cecilia slammed her sword on the floor, and the protagonist thought she was also drawing attention to herself. Throwing the sword over her shoulder, she exclaimed, don't tell her he traveled alone with all that luggage on his tiny body? The protagonist thought his father wanted Shord to accompany him, but Alan refused. He wanted to have fun alone. He answered his mother. He had an escort to Dragride, but he also wanted to learn how to be independent in society. Therefore, although his father was categorically against it, he insisted. Roselia threw herself at him with a hug and joyfully exclaimed, he's grown so much. Cecilia looked at her daughter with irritation and said, okay. She asked MC if father was definitely categorically against it. The protagonist assured her that was indeed the case. The mother looked at her son carefully and then said sternly, okay, she'll talk to their father when she gets the chance. The protagonist silently apologized to his father. He tried his best. Meanwhile, Bellwood sneezed while watering the houseplants. Grim looked at him in surprise. Shord sat in the garden, enjoying fragrant tea. He could finally rest peacefully. After a while, Alan approached the Yulgria Knight and Magic Academy. It was a state academy. For those who entered, paths to knighthood and bureaucracy were instantly open. The list of achievements of most of those who entered was endless. Every year, over 10,000 people took the exam. Of all the fighters, mages, and lords, only 100 would be accepted. He, the protagonist, planned to become a knight. He noted that the academy building was simply enormous. A day after his arrival in the capital, 2 days remained until the exam. Try as he might, MC couldn't even make out the building properly. It was good that he decided to look around and cross the gates. The protagonist began his plan with a light jog. After an hour and a half of jogging, he wondered in surprise. Wasn't that too long? He had already run 40 kilometers. He ran every day at home. Was this academy really the size of his city? However, it was an excellent substitute for training, and he would return here tomorrow. As he returned, MC thought he was hoping to inspect the future training facility. Suddenly, something caught his eye. He stopped to take a closer look and wondered if he had imagined it. Looking around, he saw nothing strange and ran on. At that moment, his friend was filming him from the bushes. Sometime later, the protagonist returned home to the Rowan family's villa in the capital. Cecilia, bringing him breakfast, asked him in surprise, "What is this?" The protagonist was sitting at the table, devouring a sandwich. He told her they were pocket rations. His mother, indignant, exclaimed, "She can see it herself. Why is he eating this?" The protagonist answered her, "He's trying to prepare himself for the exam. That's why." His mother told him that maintaining physical strength is also a knight's duty. She would be silent at breakfast, so let him eat better, and set out plates of food for him. At that moment, a sleepy Roselia came down the stairs and greeted her brother. Cecilia irritably told her daughter that she should start trying harder. Alan had been training since this morning. She'd seen his lunges and how he'd changed. MC looked at his mother in surprise. Roselia exclaimed in amazement, "Wow, praise from their mother. How interesting that sounds." She yawned again and, giggling, said, "Well, great, now they'll be living together." MC gasped and told her that he hoped to move into the dorms upon enrollment. His sister looked at him in surprise. "What?" she exclaimed indignantly. "He's joking right now, isn't he? He has no idea how much she's been anticipating his arrival." The protagonist remembered how he talked about it with his father and told her he wasn't joking. He'd even received their father's approval for it. Roselia irritably activated her power and was about to hit her brother, but the protagonist blocked her blow. She remarked in surprise, "He learned that too? He really had become better than before." MC, holding back her fist, asked her why she needed fists if she practiced magic. Was her arm weak? Roselia abruptly removed her fist from her brother's hand and kicked him. Then, to top it all off, punched him right in the face. He flew off into the distance, and Roselia said, "Thank him for worrying, but his face is soft, so there won't be any problems." She waved her hand at him, beckoning him to come to her, and offered to discuss it. The protagonist jumped up and was about to answer his sister, but Cecilia exclaimed, "Stop messing around and eat your breakfast." She told Roselia conciliatorily that even if he moved out, she would still be able to see him, and she should be grateful. The mother added, "The head of the family has given his answer, and it's not up for discussion." Roselia, unable to hold back her tears, exclaimed that Alan was a complete idiot. The protagonist, forgetting about the breakfast he'd brought, began gnawing on his pocket sandwich again. Cecilia glared at him so sternly that he had to hide it behind his back. On the day of the exam, it was raining heavily outside. Cecilia asked her son if he would be running this morning too. Alan, getting ready for practice, told her that he was. He added, "After all, today is the day." He wanted to do as usual. She looked at him with a smile and said, now she understands why their father let him go alone. The woman wished her son good luck and told him she'd be waiting for him for breakfast. While jogging, the protagonist thought about how dangerous it was to use magic in rainy weather because of the slippery roads. He decided he needed to assess the condition of the ground and use magic safely, as quickly and powerfully as possible. He needed to repeat simple but important tasks. He even enjoyed it. When he returned home, he was greeted by a cheerful Roselia. She was braiding a scarf into her hair and giggling cheerfully. The protagonist thought, looking at her, that the reason she was in such a good mood was because of the gift. He was resting the day before an exam and asked her to show him around the city. He felt ashamed of his request, so he gave her the scarf. The girl burst into tears of emotion right in front of passersby. He allowed her to choose any scarf, and she chose a scarf the same color as his hair. Meanwhile, Cecilia brought breakfast and wished the children bon appétit. The protagonist felt his mouth water at how delicious his breakfast looked. Cecilia looked at him in surprise, and Roselia laughed again. After a while, they walked him out the gate. His mother wished him luck again, and his sister joined her. He thanked them and assured them he could do it. As he walked to the academy, the protagonist noticed the rain had stopped. A few minutes later, he approached the state academy. At the main gate, it was 10 minutes to 8, and there were 10 minutes left until reception closed. MC approached the receptionist, who measured his mana capacity, which showed 2,488. The receptionist exclaimed, "Excellent." She invited him to the auditorium. When he approached, he saw a huge crowd of people applying to the academy. He thought it would be unpleasant to wait for the announcement of the mana test results. After 10 o'clock in the morning, those who don't receive a result or don't see their name on the list won't be allowed to take the exam. Out of 10,000 people, 7,000 will be eliminated. When he learned some time later that he had been admitted to the exam, the protagonist arrived at the training ground. As he approached, he noticed that the ground was soft and uncomfortable to walk on. Justin Rock suggested he choose his path and proceed to the exam. Alan asked if he could choose any path. Justin replied that it was true. He added that it didn't matter which path he chose as long as he showed good results in the practical battles. MC approached the rack with various weapons and thought about the practical exam. The examiners would lead about 2,000 people into the arena, and only 1,000 would be able to proceed. Peering closely, he thought that no matter how much he looked, he couldn't discern the teacher's sternness or the impossibility of advancing further. Watching the latest candidates struggle in their incompetence, examiner Du Oviel ruffled his hair in confusion and sternly told them to stop fighting. They were useless, and to go home. Alan thought it was a nightmare. He felt bad thinking about it, but they shouldn't have come here. In fact, they deserved it. A night examiner named Park approached him and told him with a smile that he chose him. The protagonist strode briskly toward the duel. As he passed Du, the protagonist heard him tell him to come to him. MC was practically sweating, but he thought he'd been told he could go anywhere, in which case he'd ignore this nasty examiner. Du exclaimed irritably, What's he even thinking? He could hear him perfectly well. He shouldn't ignore him. He'd already passed, so he should stop. After these words, Alan stopped and looked at the examiner in surprise. Du cursed and asked him, wasn't that him they were talking about? He was the one who had been running around the academy for 3 days? The protagonist, surprised, asked him why he was asking him that. Du said menacingly, is he underestimating the academy security? There's always a lot of attention here, especially before the exam. If some weird kid had been running around, he would have recognized him right away. The protagonist, embarrassed, said he hadn't planned anything. The examiner replied that the experts had already analyzed the video and decided that he really had just been mindlessly running. MC thought, in bewilderment, a video? Du continued. He had watched that video too, so he had passed the practical exam. A surprised Alan countered, I don't think that was enough to assess his strength. The man asked him, didn't he run this morning too? So what was that all about? He manipulated his powers to run in the rain, capable of running 40 kilometers in an hour and a half, like yesterday. This proves all his capabilities. Du cursed and added that he was experienced enough and could say for sure that if he, the protagonist, had run like that today, he would have passed the exam. Alan wondered in surprise. Was he making a bet or something? The examiner summed it up. Basically, he passed, but he still needed to evaluate him, so let him hit him at least once. The protagonist remarked in amazement. He'd heard that the elimination duel would only be the next stage. Du admitted that was true, but since no one was around, he needn't worry. MC abruptly attacked the examiner with his weapon. The man barely dodged and attacked him back. The protagonist deftly dodged his blows and blocked them with lightning speed. The other candidates watched in amazement, Du also confused. He counterattacked and MC dropped his weapon, but he didn't lose his composure and kicked him in the head. Du gasped in surprise and pain. Everyone nearby gasped. The examiner rubbed the area where he'd been struck and said how rude he was. Alan countered, saying he was the same. He told him not to worry after all. Du chuckled in confusion and said, did he predict all his attacks with the first move? He'd attacked him before he'd even finished speaking. Shouldn't he have warned him? The protagonist remembered his sister's unexpected blow and wondered, well, how can I put it? He resumed his fighting stance, expecting Du to attack. But the man, still rubbing the bruised area, remarked, practice is over. What was his name? It didn't matter. Since he passed, he should go to the academy and take the theory exam. The protagonist bowed politely to the examiner, thanked him, and told him his name. He handed his weapon over to one of the astonished candidates and headed off to take the theory test. Du watched him go, perplexed and thoughtful. As MC passed the other candidates, one of them asked him how the practical had gone. He answered, just a duel to evaluate skills. The candidate thanked him for his answer. The protagonist exclaimed along the way, he'd completely forgotten to tell them one more thing. The bearded examiner near the reception desk was in a bad mood, so it would be better if they didn't get near him. He continued walking, wondering why he even bothered to go to that field. After a while, Alan left the academy, sat down on a bench, and pulled a snack from his pocket. He thought the theory test had also passed easily. It was all over almost immediately. These were all typical tests. Returning home, the protagonist recalled his training with Dio, the fight with the examiner, and decided he needed to study more. Approaching the house, he saw his mother and sister on the porch. Roselia exclaimed with a smile, he's so good. Cecilia said he worked hard and they decided to throw him a celebration. He joyfully turned to his mother and sister and exclaimed that he was home. The next day, the exam results were announced. He came to find out the results with Cecilia. The night before, his mother had said the results would be announced tomorrow. Would she be able to see them? The protagonist nearly choked on his food in surprise. The woman continued, saying she wanted to see the exam results with him. He turned to her doubtfully, and Cecilia smiled and said that, frankly, she was more confident in his success than he was. If he was a good son, should he let her see the results too? The protagonist smiled and thought that if she said so, he had no reason to refuse her. However, the mother rejected the same wish of his sister, because she would have to study. And so the next day, he came with his mother at 10:30 a.m. to find out the results. Approaching the scoreboard, they began peering at it, searching for his name. MC thought he was completely confident of his admission, but in his past life, even with all his efforts, he hadn't gotten where he wanted. At that moment, Cecilia pointed to the scoreboard and told him, there it is. The protagonist stared at the results in amazement. Sometime before the academy exam scores were announced, several people had gathered for a meeting. Godfin von Vankush, wearing a large mage's hat, asked Emmy, the State Academy's magic instructor, to replay the video of the protagonist stepping onto the ground. The girls showed him the moment without question. The old man stared thoughtfully at the screen. At that moment, Dante, the Academy's night examiner, asked him if he was also interested in this. Godfin looked at him and said, ah, it's him. Dante thought, watching the video, he was walking so calmly. He, Godfin, had even prepared the ground to restrict movement and limit power. Justin Roque, the night examiner, had said so that they could monitor the actions of those who had arrived. In other words, their ability and willingness to use magic under such conditions. That was the only parameter being tested. He turned to Godfin and continued with a smile. Good thing he thought of that. The old man answered them, wanting to test their potential. Generally, such a complex approach wasn't necessary to test their abilities, but for this guy, even that seemed too easy. Dante remarked, since it's the same guy running around the school, he's clearly not bad. At that moment, Muika Ugria, the academy's vice principal, announced, that's it. They have to announce the exam results tomorrow at 10 a.m. Let everyone focus on their work. Her subordinates responded eagerly. Duel entered the office and said he knew they would think the same. That's why he decided to test his abilities. Godfin replied. He'd heard about it. He's useful, as always. Muiko was irritated that everyone was distracted from their work again. Park entered and told Du that he practically stole this guy from him. He almost approached him, but then Du intervened. Godfin turned to Du and asked him to tell them what he thought of the protagonist. Du remarked with bewilderment. You could tell just by looking at him. He had excellent reflexes. If they accepted him, he'd be the best. He'd give him a 10. Everyone present stared at him in surprise. A 10 was the highest possible score on the exam. Du continued. When Alan attacked, he'd let him do whatever he wanted. When he counterattacked, the protagonist released his weapon and delivered a kickflow. He'd done it all so quickly. Especially on the ground the old man had prepared. His level of magic was simply incredible. He thought it was more than enough. At that moment, Dante asked to speak. He turned to Du and said, the boy really is good, but, commander of the third block of the Court Knights, Lightning, is there anyone who could even touch a hair on his head? Du answered him, as the protagonist threw his sword. He then looked at its landing spot and realized he'd done it that way on purpose, aiming for his blind spot. Dante said he'd wondered why he'd dropped his sword, but now it all became clear. Du added, moreover, he'd immediately prepared for the next attack. What surprised him even more was that he'd even taken into account the number of people around him. Park noted that a sudden attack at the very beginning was no less striking. He understood why some people didn't agree with him as a knight, but he also understood those who admired him. Godfin asked, isn't it obvious? It doesn't matter who the opponent is. The main thing is victory. For those who think differently, there's no future, Du said. This guy wasn't going to attack him stupidly. Even when he said he wouldn't hurt him, his expression didn't change. Godfin laughed and said he liked the protagonist. He'd take him. Muiko exclaimed angrily. No way. He's already decided to mentor Class A. They don't know which class he'll be assigned to. It depends on the theoretical exam. Everyone understood there were 100 spots available for first years. Those who pass will be sorted from Class A to E, with 20 students per class. The old man said irritably, he doesn't care. They only have geniuses. Justin, laughing, noted that even if he was a genius, many people simply don't know how to study. Godfin looked at him carefully and asked if he wanted to argue. The boy answered that he did. Du said conciliatorily, okay, he has to go. Everyone get ready for tomorrow. Muiko said warily, it's time for them to discuss others. Justin had noticed, that's for sure. He turned to his colleagues and asked them if they saw what happened in the video afterward. The old man replied, perplexed, no, they didn't. The boy continued laughing. No one else approached Du. He was too scary. Everyone laughed. Du exclaimed irritably, how could he possibly scare little kids? Justin said, well yes, he was in a good mood, but no one approached him because of his charming smile. Of course, he had such a face, Park cheerfully remarked. What a great angle. Du angrily told him to stop laughing. Godfin sternly said, this is not the time for laughter. If applicants have that kind of attitude, it's not good. Everyone immediately became serious and looked at the old man in surprise. Emmy took the lollipop out of her mouth and said, she knows why no one approached him. All the examiners looked at her in bewilderment. The girl played them the part of the video where the protagonist told the applicants that the bearded examiner was rather cruel and in a bad mood. No one should come into his sight, the girl said. This rumor spread like wildfire among the children. Everyone watched the video attentively. After the video, everyone looked at Du. Godfin, unable to contain himself, burst into his booming laugh and exclaimed, hilarious. Everyone around him started laughing too. Du, outraged beyond words, said, this guy's a bastard. He, the head of the knighthood, thinks he can find time to monitor his stubble. Even though he hadn't slept all night, he decided to use his rest to help out as an examiner. The video continued, and there was a moment where the protagonist bowed to him and told him his name. Du's colleagues continued to laugh good-naturedly like, Lightning, he screwed up so badly, the man exclaimed indignantly, as if they were all so perfect. And anyway, he decided he was betting on this protagonist failing. Currently, the protagonist and Cecilia were watching his results. The board showed that he had passed the exam, his mana was 4, practical chivalry exam was 8, theoretical exam was 8, entrance class was A, overall score was 450. MC couldn't believe what he saw. He thought, he's happy. Is it really him? It shocked him so much. He felt out of his mind for now. But still, he should be happy about the result of his hard work. The protagonist happily turned to his mother. Cecilia read the results over and over again, amazement written on her face. Alan looked at her warily. She thought, Mana, everything is clear with it. Practical exam? Something she didn't understand. Maybe they wrote it wrong? 8 for theory. Something is wrong here. Entrance class A? The protagonist turned to his mother again and asked her what this class meant. Cecilia suddenly hugged her son and congratulated him on entering this class. She added, he achieved all this himself. She's very proud of him. MC was very surprised by his mother's open emotions. Cecilia looked at him carefully and told him that she believed in him. Then she smiled and said she was going home. She needed to report his progress to his father and Short, who were awaiting the results. She added, he remembers that orientation is at 11 o'clock, right? He'll be late for his first day if he doesn't hurry. Alan, inspired by his mother's pride, thanked her for the delicious breakfast. The woman looked at him in surprise. MC thought, she's not really good at homework, but she still cooks for him, so he better thank her. He waved and shouted that he was leaving. As the protagonist approached his classroom, he stopped. The protagonist realized that he was very nervous. He had spent his past life entirely studying. At this academy, he wanted to live a full student life, playing with friends, dating a girl, participating in club activities, and for example, working as a guild member. And no matter the outcome, this is the beginning of his fun. With these thoughts, he opened the classroom door. Fyun met him there. She told him she had been waiting for him and was beginning to think she wouldn't be able to meet him. The protagonist slammed the door shut in surprise, sweating from the tension. The girl left the classroom and told him to stop reacting that way. At that moment, a boy called out to the protagonist and asked if he was Alan Rowan. He introduced himself as Aldor Angraver, told him that was his name, and added that he was pleased to meet him. The protagonist said with a smile that his Viscount family was renowned for its ability to grow anju trees, necessary for crafting magical staves, right? He was also pleased to meet them. Aldor was surprised by his knowledge of his family. They shook hands, and the boy told Alan he was pleased. MC thought with pleasure. He'd already learned all the information about all the Viscounts. Fyun whispered irritably, but the protagonist didn't react to her like that. The protagonist thought he should just ignore her. Aldor drew their attention to the boy standing next to him and said he wanted to introduce them to his friend, Coconiel Canardia. The boy looked at the protagonist sheepishly and said he was also very pleased to meet him. MC shook his hand and told him the Encyclopedia of Monsters, written by his clan, Canardia, was an amazing book. Surprised, Coconiel was amazed by this and offered to be friends with the protagonist. Fyun exclaimed irritably, why did he cram information about an encyclopedia that wasn't even mentioned on the exam? Alan angrily replied, what difference does it make? The new friends looked at them in surprise. Then Aldor introduced them to another guy, Leo Zatzinger. He expressed confidence that the protagonist knew him. MC remembered he was a member of one of the 3 ducal families. Leo looked at the protagonist seriously and expressed hope that they would become friends. Fyun whispered sarcastically to Alan, please don't fall to your knees. He advised her to shut up. Extending his hand to Leo, MC said that he was also glad to meet him. But Leo didn't offer his hand and looked at him with displeasure. Aldor said, the world is big. Since he's high on the list, he should expect difficulties. There are many difficult people, and he needs to be able to befriend them. The protagonist wondered in surprise, where did they manage to become such friends? Aldor turned to him and said, so, he'll tell him, a newbie, a few things. Everyone was sweating profusely to break Leo's records. The protagonist thought in amazement, absolute records? In other words, even among the best students in the country, he's the best. He himself can't become that. At that moment, Fyun turned to him and exclaimed that now he had to introduce her, his friend, to these people. MC noted irritably, she lives in her own world. Everyone already knows her. The girl spread her arms wide and repeated, come on, Alan. Let him introduce her. More than a friend, less than a lover. He hissed back. Don't let her make up this relationship for them. She's less than a friend, and even less than an acquaintance. And anyway, he doesn't even know her. Fyun exclaimed indignantly, it's just awful how cruel he is. Even though he held her in his arms all night, the protagonist couldn't contain himself and angrily exclaimed, don't let her talk nonsense. Why did she make all this up? The girl mockingly asked him, can't he reel in a fish that bit itself? Although he was showing off in front of her, he cut it all short with the urge to go to the restroom. She circled him like a predator, then dramatically fell to her knees and said, but she's satisfied with this. Just let her be near him. The protagonist indignantly began to justify himself to his new friends. She's lying. Leo turned to him coldly and asked him why he'd entered this academy. Alan exclaimed in confusion, thinking he'd imagined something too. But the guy looked at him with such a cold gaze that the protagonist immediately became serious and replied that he'd entered to do what he wanted with more freedom. Seeing the sour expressions on his newfound allies' faces, the MC despairingly told them they'd misunderstood him. Leo said that what he wants to do is become strong and protect the country and its people. The protagonist looked at him quizzically, then replied that he had no such lofty goals. He simply wanted to have fun and live an interesting life. He thought that perhaps he should come to the academy for that purpose. Leo asked him with barely concealed irritation. So, he was planning to do everything just for himself? He was a nobleman after all. Shouldn't his goal be to protect the country's citizens? The protagonist thought for a moment, then said with a smile, no, it shouldn't. He was only the 3rd son of a barely known family. Everyone present looked at him, some with disapproval, some with bewilderment. Even Fyun fell silent, listening in amazement. The protagonist continued, he will only protect what he wants to protect. Their ideals aren't the same, and they believe in different things. He just wants to live freely, that's all. MC added more seriously, and this desire of his won't change, even under threat of death. Leo, who had been silent for several minutes, said in an icy tone. Now it was clear to him, he was right. They wouldn't see eye to eye no matter what. At that moment, Godfin appeared next to them. He grinned and remarked, I think they've already met. The protagonist wondered in surprise. Who was this old man? He hadn't even noticed him. The others present whispered in amazement. The great Godorphin, serving as the second night mage? It was unbelievable. He had actually come here to see them. MC wondered in bewilderment. Is this old man famous? Godorphin addressed all the students in Class A and congratulated them on the start of the school year. The old man told them his name, adding that he was their homeroom teacher and that he saw familiar faces. His classmates began to whisper that he, this old war hero, was the ideal battle mage. But why the Academy's ruler's right-hand man? The protagonist wondered, perplexed. A knight battle mage? Doru said he'd been weak at first, only making it to Class E. But by toiling day and night, he'd mastered all the paths of knight and mage, earning his title. Alan thought it was all clear now. The old man suggested to everyone, perhaps they should continue their introductions? The protagonist raised his hand and asked permission to ask him a question. Godorphin said in surprise, could it really be Alan Rowan? The protagonist activated his power to a bright light, bowed to the old man, and exclaimed, he's asking to become his apprentice. Everyone around him watched in amazement. MC thought, how lucky to have a mage as a teacher. He can't miss this chance. The old man, thoughtfully stroking his beard, replied, the topic of the conversation was completely different. But what can you do? He doesn't want to beat around the bush. He added, everyone has seen the lists, and Alan's name has a special symbol, the letter A under an exclamation point. This means his acceptance is still in question. Everyone gasped, and the protagonist thought in bewilderment, acceptance is in question? The old man looked at the puzzled protagonist and told him that he was suspected of cheating on the exam. He's given a choice, prove his knowledge and stay at the academy, or leave, admitting he's a cheater. The protagonist felt like his head was about to explode. Was he a cheater? Getting a perfect score on his practical seemed suspicious. Dew told him he'd passed, right in front of everyone before the exam even started. Maybe it was a mistake, but he did participate. Why are they even suspecting him in the first place? The academy itself is to blame for its irresponsibility, and now it's trying to shift the blame onto him. But that won't do. Alan, filled with righteous anger, moved straight toward Leo. He stood in front of him and glared angrily into his face. Godorphin told Leo to step back. Then the old man asked MC, so he wants to inflate his value? The protagonist answered him, he didn't cheat. The academy itself is to blame for the kind of examiner they assigned him. He has nothing to prove. And now, with all his anger, he added, but anyone who gets in his way, he will crush. Complete silence reigned in the classroom. Everyone shocked by what was happening. The old man asked in bewilderment, what's wrong? He was suspected of cheating on the theory exam. The protagonist felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He looked at Godorphin, confused, then began pacing the room. Everyone watched him closely. Finally, Alan stopped and asked the old man if he could explain everything to him. Fyun sarcastically remarked to him that he wouldn't crush the teacher. The protagonist was ready to kill her at that moment. Godorphin showed him the test sheet and said he was suspected because of the significant discrepancy between his past work and yesterday's exam. His progress can hardly be called normal. Of course, they analyzed all his actions, but they found no confirmation. Even with the judges selected, the result was the same. The old man continued, even if such effective methods for cheating exist, people don't change that quickly. How did he succeed so well? Could he convince him otherwise? MC considered telling him that when he was reborn, he fell in love with studying, but if only he could say that. He needed to be sincere. So he told the old man that he had been studying for the past 3 months, because his life depended on it. Godorphin spoke too clichédly. Such an answer wouldn't do. The protagonist more quietly said, teacher. He had a good teacher. The old man looked at him in surprise. Alan continued, his teacher's name is Shord. The protagonist mentally apologized to his teacher. The old man remarked in surprise. Was he trying to say that one single teacher had changed him so much? The protagonist exclaimed that it was true. He used to hate studying, but the teacher had trained him so hard for lessons that he didn't even eat properly or sleep. For 3 months, he slept only 3 hours a day and ate only dry rations for breakfast and dinner. Godorphin, listening to him in amazement, decided to catch him out. He asked the protagonist with interest how he liked the new salami-flavored dry rations. MC, without hesitation, answered that they were simply awful. The old man sheepishly said that he was the one who put them into production. The protagonist was simply stunned by his words. He felt simply uncomfortable. Therefore, he said it was Shord who taught his heart cruelty. He always told him they were on a battlefield. He took breaks no longer than 5 minutes, and sometimes even wore diapers so as not to waste time on the restroom, and he devoted all his time to him, the protagonist. The protagonist continued. His teacher supported him, just as he had his sister, who had entered college last year. Their achievements together demonstrate what a good teacher he is. Fyun exclaimed with interest. So the zealous Rose has the same story? MC thought angrily, wishing she'd shut up already. Aldor said in surprise, the zealous Rose? So, Alan is the brother of the victim of the red carpet incident? Alan was surprised. He hadn't expected that. Godorphin wondered what the story was. Aldor told him that 4 years ago in the main hall of the State Academy, the young marquises had brutally treated Roselia. But instead of panicking, the young lady had sent every last one to the hospital. Since then, not a single marquise had been seen at the academy. The old man remembered. Yes, he had heard of this story. After all, she was considered a victim, but she refused to take the exam. She said these words without any explanation. The protagonist thought about his sister in surprise. Had she really done this just to avoid discussing it with her mother? Out of 100,000 test takers, only half as many had passed as usual? He thought it was because the exam was difficult. Aldor said in surprise, The victim, the zealous Rose. Alan was her brother. Fyun exclaimed, "How interesting!" MC thought irritably, wondering what was so interesting about that. Godfin finally spoke up. He understood better now. It was Short who taught her how to navigate the battlefield. The protagonist wondered in amazement. What did he understand? The old man turned to the protagonist and said, "Fine, they'll discuss this later. If it's decided he didn't cheat, he'll be transferred to Class E." Alan asked him in surprise. "Class E?" The teacher replied. There were people in the past who claimed they didn't cheat, but were transferred to that class. However, that was only because they weren't capable of anything else. MC considered it. It didn't really matter to him. It would even be easier for him to enjoy his student life there. The old man, looking at him, muttered in surprise, "He's not even arguing." After their one-on-one conversation, he felt Alan hadn't cheated, but he was still hiding something. Godfin, after a brief pause, said, addressing everyone. He usually didn't end conversations lightly, but now he had all the conditions. This applies to everyone here. At best, in 10 years, at worst, in just a couple, their country would likely enter into a war with the Rosemere Empire to the north. Everyone listened to him in surprise, not saying a word. The old man continued. He would speak briefly. Everyone in this academy was selected from the best talents in the country, and from among them, another 20 of the best will be chosen to support the country. His Majesty expects him to cultivate ideal fighters. Not everyone is obliged to become soldiers, of course. That depends on whether they want to live. War is a common cause. If they graduate from the academy, they can take leading positions in the army and fulfill their duty. In other words, the country could be missing out on talent simply because of their cheating. He asked the students what they thought about this. The old man looked at the frowning protagonist and told him that to stay in Class A, he needed to get approval from every single one of his classmates this week, so that they would all agree that he was worthy of being in their class, and he would personally report this information to His Majesty and obtain his permission. Did he agree to this? Normally, Godfin wouldn't have said all this in front of the entire class. He was swayed by the protagonist's mood, and it amused him. He wondered how the tables would turn if he had to keep an eye on him. The protagonist stood in the middle of the classroom, pondering. After a while, he asked the old man if there was any point in staying in this class. The astonished Godfin replied that there was nothing to it, but although he didn't want to say it, he could gain personal gain in the future if he said he was in Class A. By the way, don't let him tell you that. As a Short student, he's willing to stay in just Class E. MC said firmly, "No, he absolutely isn't." He thought, come what may, there's no way he'll get his classmates' approval now. He's suspected of cheating, and he wouldn't want that either. And at a time like this, do they really need a classmate who's going to live for himself? And Fyun's always talking nonsense. The main problem was that he didn't really want to do that. He decided to pretend to study and transfer to another class. The protagonist said again, "No way." At that moment, Fyun raised her hand, apologized to the teacher, and asked him if she could have her say. The homeroom teacher asked her what was wrong. The girl asked him what they needed to do to recommend Alan. The old man told her it was simple. They needed to report their opinion to him. Fyun placed her hand on her chest and declared, in her own name, that she considered Alan worthy enough to be in the first year of Class A. Godfin replied that her opinion had been accepted. At that moment, Perry Abenil, Duke of the Abenil family, indignantly turned to Fyun and exclaimed, what was she thinking? She was voting on behalf of the family, and after such unacceptable behavior, the protagonist is a simple rich villager. The girl brazenly answered him, it's all because she, a representative of the Dragoon family, wants to vote for him. In their time, every nobleman must be able to take risks. She turned to him and said more quietly, will he finally shut his mouth? The boy was embarrassed and turning to the protagonist said angrily, he will tear it off, that mask off his face, and show it to Miss Fyun. MC looked at him in surprise. After the introductions were over, Alan headed home as quickly as he could. He walked and thought he'll be going to Class E anyway. He didn't want to get close to anyone yet. He went into the dorm at the State Academy and asked the registrar that he would like to register for a room. Sula asked him if he was a new student. She told him her name and added that she was the dorm supervisor. The woman told him to write his name and class here. When the protagonist did this, she looked at his entry and asked him, he's the one who got the highest score, and he's accused of cheating. She covered her mouth with her hand in amazement and asked him, so how did he do it? The protagonist, looking straight into her eyes, said, somehow. The woman chuckled. Okay. She added that there was one rule here in the dorm. He should look at the sign. MC read the inscription on the wall. Live with honor and a desire for knowledge. He grinned and looked at Sula. The commandant said that meals were served here for 1,000 ria per month, with breakfasts served from 6 to 8:30. He should notify her if he didn't eat. She then explained that inside the rooms there was a private restroom and a shared bathroom. It was huge. The entrance was on the right. He could take a look. It was open from 6 to 10 p.m. The protagonist thought happily, a huge bathroom? Sula was perplexed by his satisfied expression. even after all the explanations. He was a strange fellow. The woman added irritably that students in Class A and above could rent rooms in a better class for the same price. This place was for dogs who couldn't even afford a room more expensive than this. This dorm was considered a kennel where scum collected. The protagonist smiled and told her he liked it here. He was asking her to take care of him for the next 3 years, and he expressed hope that they would get along. Sula looked at him puzzled at first, but then she burst into laughter and said she hoped he would be just as happy after a week. That same evening there was another meeting at the academy about the fact that even with everyone's consent and proof that Alan hadn't cheated, he would still be transferred to Class E. Du exclaimed irritably. He didn't agree. Shored Vin Force with the mindset of a soldier, there are no such teachers. He's sure the boy pulled himself together and learned. Muika said, everyone except Mr. Du agrees. It's ridiculous. She's already gathered people to find out who this Short is, Dante remarked in surprise. But wouldn't it be too cruel to transfer him from Class A? Maybe they should keep him in this class until everything is confirmed? Justin replied with a chuckle that after what Alan had done at the introduction, there was no way he could gain everyone's trust. Godorphin remarked, yes, he'd completely forgotten himself while chatting about such trivialities. The protagonist was worthless, but those taking the exam for their academy were expected to be able to overcome such obstacles. If he couldn't complete their task, was it even worth keeping him around? Justin noted that everything was clear to him. Godorphin had planned everything to test his abilities. Now he, too, thought this was the perfect test, as expected of the old man. Godorphin added mysteriously that the protagonist wasn't the only one who had received a perfect score. Dante and Justin exchanged puzzled glances. Meanwhile, at the freshmen's meeting, Leo watched Pharaon closely. The next day, protagonist woke up at 5 a.m. as usual. The room he was now living in might have been too simple for him, but he was quite satisfied with it. There was a free washing machine, and a company testing detergents was located nearby. Alan completed all the necessary procedures and left the dorm. After exiting the main gate to the south, he walked toward the academy, circling it clockwise. He had found this spot in the forest on his first day. It was a beautiful place with a 500-meter path and many beautiful forks. He encountered 10 hills along the way. Afterwards, he trained with his sword for half an hour, constantly recalling his sparring sessions with Dio. While warming up, the protagonist reflected that he had begun the first day of his new life with a routine and without any problems. At 8 a.m., he arrived at the dorm dining hall. Sula irritably noted that he was late. His first day, and already late? MC said in surprise. But there's still an hour until closing time, isn't there? The woman silently handed him 2 burgers and a glass of milk. The protagonist also began eating in silence. When he took a bite, he grimaced. There was so much oil. He felt as if the pork had been soaked in oil for a month. Now it was clear to him why no one else had come here. But throwing food away was against his rules, so he courageously continued eating his burgers. Sula laughed and said, he's strong. Judging by his morning, he specializes in physical strength, right? She added that today's burgers were intended for mages and were supposed to imbue them with mana. If he had enough strength to eat them tomorrow, she would prepare him a menu for developing physical strength. The protagonist was surprised by her words. He asked her if such a thing was possible. Sula said with a grin that correctly combining monster ingredients, skill, and magic isn't that difficult. Although she isn't directly involved in cooking, she is still a monster researcher. The students in this cafeteria are essentially just guinea pigs, using them to conduct her experiments. The protagonist thought perplexedly, did she mean mice? He looked at the burger he had bitten and said, monster ingredients, that's why it tastes like that. Sula replied that no, in fact, she didn't care about taste. MC looked at her in surprise and questioningly. The woman said, it contains all the necessary vitamins. If he wants tasty food, he can buy it somewhere else, even at the academy itself. She laughed so creepily that Alan thought she was sick, like his sister. Roselia would probably tell him what her brother thinks about her now. He thought decisively, who cares? The protagonist exclaimed, he wants to learn magic, no matter what, but he doesn't have the predisposition. Does she know what ingredients and vitamins can help him? Sula said thoughtfully, unfortunately not. This is a well-known problem that is currently being actively addressed. If a solution is found, it will shake the entire world, he drawled sadly. Is that so? Sula asked him in surprise. Didn't he score first on the practical exam? He was talented in the physical realm. She added that physical development was a direct path to knighthood. There are many examples of magical knights who couldn't decide which area to develop in, despite having a penchant for physical development. Therefore, they are completely lost in the world. What use is magic to him? The protagonist answered her, he simply wants to learn it. He doesn't care what others think. He thought about Shord. He would now say, monster research for cooking? What nonsense. Sula looked closely at the protagonist and told him there was a high chance this wish would come true, but it could also easily fail. If so, she could help him. The protagonist happily thanked the woman. She laughed and remarked on his quick response. How interesting. If he's so pumped, they can start tomorrow. The woman added, hurry up and finish his breakfast and get ready for the academy. Otherwise, he'll be late. MC quickly devoured his burgers. He thought, on the other hand, if he ate like this, he'd be able to adapt to the battlefield faster. He'd be able to make changes to his routine on the very first day. Yesterday, he'd received his uniform in his room, and now, After breakfast, he quickly began to change into it. Having finished this task and straightened his tie, the protagonist looked in the mirror and declared, "Wonderful. Now, finally, his school life has begun." The uniform suited him perfectly. He immediately looked more mature and respectable. Leaving the dorm, he ran towards the academy, mentally exclaiming, "Here he goes, Class E." Godfin had named the conditions under which he could remain in Class A. All his classmates must give him recommendations. Even though the assignment was unreasonable, he didn't want to do it right away. The deadline was in a week, a terribly useless waste of a week. When he ran into the classroom, everyone looked at him with different expressions. He laughed to himself and thought, "So here comes a problem child. Let them all prepare for this." Aldor asked him. "He's been walking a tightrope from the start, right?" He wanted to tell him something. The protagonist looked at him questioningly. Aldor, embarrassed, said, "They, from Endumion territory, are very sorry for causing his sister problems. Of course, something like this can't be forgiven with just an apology." The protagonist was genuinely surprised. Should he apologize? Besides, he was sure his sister had already forgiven them. Besides, it didn't matter to him. He could communicate with him as usual. At first, Aldor couldn't believe his ears. Then he smiled and told him he understood. Fyun approached them and wished Alan a good morning. She asked him, by the way, why he'd gone to the main dorm. She'd even considered asking the guard to put them in rooms close to each other. MC, smiling, asked her if she could change rooms. At that moment, Godfin entered the classroom and announced, "That's all here," apparently. It was a bit of a surprise, but they were going to have a training session on body-enhancing magic. For that, they needed to go to the arena. Aldor, surprised, asked him if students from all years would be practicing. The old man replied that they didn't need mages who couldn't defend themselves in a real fight, or civil servants who lacked practical skills. The academy's policy was to develop multidisciplinary specialists. Everyone listened attentively to the teacher. Alan thought, so the knights were training too, and listening to lectures on magic. This was getting more and more interesting. When the students arrived at the arena, the old man said he remembered very well what their practical exams had been like. First, have them introduce themselves to their classmates. Then they need to pair up with a suitable person and have a mock battle. Those left without a partner will simply watch. The protagonist thought dejectedly, well, so what? Pairing up? In his past life, he was always alone and got injured. At that moment, Perry called out to him and said he didn't think he'd get the chance to teach him a lesson so soon. Alan thought, this Perry? He knows how much he hates him, right? The boy pointed a defiant finger at him and declared he's challenging him to a fight. If he loses, he will not give him a recommendation under any circumstances, even if Fyun herself orders him to do so. The protagonist, looking at him irritably, told him not to go back on his word. Perry called out to the old man and shouted at him, on his own behalf, entrusting the decision on Alan's recommendation to the outcome of the mock battle. Godfin chuckled in surprise and answered, "Fine." The protagonist thought, okay, a great opportunity. If he loses to him, he won't be able to fulfill the conditions. Then he won't even have to wait a whole week. At that moment, Fyun appeared from behind the protagonist and told him not to worry. She'll make Perry give him a recommendation, no matter the cost. MC indignantly responded, "Stop saying such terrible things. Even so, that guy is very confident." He examined his weapon and asked the girl if his opponent was strong. Fyun thoughtfully said, "She thinks if he does this a few times, he won't be able to defeat him." The protagonist was surprised. What did she mean? The protagonist looked at Perry and noticed that he had picked up a spear. Now he remembered. The Abanil Count family was known for being a military family, even if they were related to the Dragoon family. The head of the family was a renowned spearmaster among his relatives, and the protagonist knew that it was difficult to fight back if one had never wielded a spear before. Because he lacked experience, he completely lost to Dio, a C-rank researcher, without even flinching. Of course, he couldn't win then. But after that, he trained a lot, using his imagination. I wonder how he'll handle a spear now? He'll also test the results of his training on him. MC bowed to his opponent and asked him to treat him well. Perry immediately assumed a fighting stance, and the protagonist did the same. He thought the guy would surely lunge right away. Perry indeed lunged, and the protagonist took a half step back. The guy attacked the protagonist with incredible speed. Leo watched their actions intently. Fyun worried about Alan. MC thought in surprise that even though he had seen everything, his opponent almost hit him. His speed and agility were greater than he expected. He was able to increase his speed and reach him by rotating his left hand so that it formed a cylinder with his right. So that's the spear lunge technique. Perry was furious. Why didn't he hit him? He attacked Alan again, increasing his speed even further, but the protagonist deftly avoided his blow. MC, looking at his angry opponent, thought, it's simple. His spear skills are too good. He slams into the ground, tries to keep his feet at a certain distance, but instead he tells him where to aim. His talent is undoubtedly far superior to Dio's, but Dio is stronger, and Perry's ideology is different from Dio's, who has experienced real battles with monsters. But there's one problem. If the old man looks at him like that, how could he lose? Last evening, a meeting of Class A first years was held in the Academy dorm's cafeteria. Fyun was the organizer, and only 18 of the 20 attended. Kate Sarkamba from the general course said, as Fyun had said, the protagonist is quite interesting. Jewelry Revelance from the mage course said, not just quite, but to prove yourself on the very first day. Stella Acurius, a viscount from the knights course, said it for sure. She thought Fyun had a new toy. Aldor exclaimed how much Fyun knew about Alan's power. Stella said most of all, she wanted to know how far they'd gone with him that they couldn't get out until 6 in the morning. Everyone laughed at her words. Jewelry said, she said they met at magic training? Every room has a guard, right? So where did they hide? Her classmates grimaced. How dirty. Fyun smiled and replied, forgive her for dashing their hopes, but she still hadn't figured out how to eliminate him. As they all saw, he didn't care about her at all. Kate adjusted her glasses on her nose and noted that this was to be expected. He blushed and paled while she teased him. He was clearly still pure. Baron spoke up, saying she gathered them all to discuss his recommendation. She wanted to know what they thought of him, and she couldn't lose since she'd mentioned her family's name. Jewelry asked her, puzzled, what she was talking about. The girls looked at each other in confusion. The mage asked her if she knew he'd blown everyone's minds during his self-introduction. Kate echoed the girl's words. Furthermore, Godfin even mentioned the crisis in the kingdom and told everyone that with enough recommendations, he'd seek His Majesty's approval. Stella echoed these last words. Kate continued, even the Dragoon family made no secret of their intention to support him. Stella added, on the other hand, they have no reason to kick him out of class. Aldor exclaimed, that's right, he even knows the intricacies of this place, so his ability is obvious. He seems a little stubborn, but he's not one to lie. From Coconiel standing next to him, it was clear he supported his friend's words. Leo stood silently near the column. Finally, he spoke to Fyun. He wasn't such a fool as to involve personal feelings in this. He'd entered the academy to continue his education among similarly gifted individuals. Until it was proven he'd cheated, he had no reason to expel the man with the highest score on the practical exam. But he wasn't going to vouch for him on his family's behalf until he was certain of his skills. Fyun, placing a glass of juice on the table, spoke, and she did too. The girl turned to all her classmates and asked if they all agreed. Then, to eliminate any questions, she would lay a better foundation. And so, in the training arena, the protagonist and Perry clashed. After a short period of combat, Perry became exhausted and fell to the ground. Godfin cried out, enough, he's out of mana, someone should offer him a hand. His classmates helped him to his feet. The protagonist thought in surprise, how could this be? The fight had only been 10 minutes, hadn't it? At that moment, Leo turned MC. He looked at Alan with a determined gaze and asked if he would fight him. The protagonist looked at him with interest. They were talking about an exhibition match between a pair. He looked at the teacher, and Godfin spread his arms wide, as if to say, let him do as he please. Alan thought, but on the other hand, it's a chance. After all, when he transfers to another class, he'll hardly have the opportunity to fight an opponent of such caliber. He was already confused himself, but he decided to test his position. The protagonist assumed a welcoming stance and politely bowed his head to Leo. Everyone watched them attentively. The opponents assumed a fighting stance and prepared to attack. Leo made a quick lunge towards Alan. The protagonist deftly dodged his blow and thought in surprise, quite quickly. But not so quickly that he couldn't react. If he blocked his blow, it would cost him his promotion to another class. So with the next blow, MC gave in slightly and took a blow to the head. Blood appeared on his face. He fell, but then leaped to his feet with lightning speed and approached Leo at the speed of sound. The boy thought in surprise, so this is it. The physical enhancement of a man who got the highest score on the entrance exam. Leo guessed that this was probably not the protagonist's full strength. He clearly realized that after that blow, he's on a completely different level, and a demonstration fight can't overcome that difference. But he certainly surprised him. The protagonist looked at his opponent with anticipation and thought he almost wanted to make him cry. Wasn't he stalking him? Who did he take him for? That evening, when Fyun called a class meeting in the dorm cafeteria, everyone was certain of one thing. The protagonist had impeccable preparation. Fyun approached them and asked if they could go to the teacher early the next morning and give their recommendations. She would leave it up to them whether to use their family names. Aldor said in surprise, everything has already been thought out to the very end. Why the rush? Fyun sarcastically thanked him for his help. She added, Alan probably thinks getting into Class A is a piece of cake, but maybe he thinks it'll be even better in Class E. Everyone stared at her in surprise. Kate said in bewilderment, no, that can't be. She had a vague idea from his words and actions, but she didn't want to believe it. Jewelry said, is that even possible? Aldor ruffled his hair and muttered, he cried with joy along with his family when he learned of his admission. Fyun put a finger to her lips and told them that Alan seemed to live in his own world, or perhaps in another dimension. She was simply certain that he had something he wanted to achieve, no matter the cost. She didn't know what it was, but for this, he would give up his A-class qualification without hesitation. A servant from the aristocratic household joined them and told Fyun that he had fulfilled her request. The girl took the piece of paper from his hands, read it, and exclaimed, Alan headed there immediately. It seemed he didn't see himself as an A-class candidate. Stella irritably told her not to look down on him. She added that the entire first-year group from Class A would go after him. Fyun told her to pretend she hadn't heard their conversation that day. If possible, she'd prefer to be considered incompetent. That would be fine as long as Alan was on guard. So it was all decided in one day. That day, Alan ordered a large portion of noodles, and that same day, Perry arrived. Jewelry declared that she'd agree, but on one condition, she'd get a D portion. The classmates began to buzz, a declaration of war, although both boys were quite strong. And now the protagonist looked at his opponent, wondering why he wasn't pursuing him. He decided to change tactics and attacked Leo first. The boy barely managed to block his blow, but he still stood his ground. Everyone watched the duel tensely. The protagonist realized he couldn't defeat him with force. He could only overwhelm him with sheer numbers. He'd been attacking him for 30 minutes now. The irritating expression had disappeared, but no crack had appeared. Maybe he should take a chance? He boosted his weapon and lunged at his opponent. The protagonist brought his face close to Leo, and the boy's eyes splattered with the protagonist's blood. Alan thought, a move he'd never shown anyone before. Leo closed his eyes, MC activated a golden orb, and kneed the opponent in his weakest spot. The boy managed to block his blow for a second, and the protagonist thought in surprise, he even blocked that? It doesn't matter. He repeated his blow, and Leo couldn't resist, flying back from the protagonist's blow. Aldor's mouth dropped open in amazement. Godfin couldn't believe his eyes. Fyun, like everyone else, was stunned by the outcome of the fight. The protagonist chuckled and thought, well, that's it. If he can't dodge it in the air, he'll show his mettle on the ground. But then something happened that MC never expected. Leo jumped up and activated his magical power in the form of a fiery volley, which he aimed at Alan. Everyone fell silent, tensely awaiting what would happen next. The protagonist covered himself with his arms crossed and took the blow. He was thrown a fair distance away from his opponent, and thick, viscous smoke billowed everywhere. Leo approached the protagonist who was lying on the ground and held his weapon to his throat. MC began making sounds that resembled laughter. Leo looked at him in surprise. The protagonist had spoken. He had lost. He had given it his all, and he had lost. He thought it would have been much quicker if Leo had used external magic from the start. He was annoyed, but at the same time, his soul was somehow refreshed. He covered his eyes with his hand, turned to Leo, and told him that one day he would definitely make him cry. He would get out of Class E, become stronger, and rise to the top. Leo answered that he seemed to still have some strength left. Does he realize that his endurance is beyond normal? MC said, it's all nonsense. He just runs hard in the mornings. Leo looked at him carefully, then turned to the old man. He said, he, Leo, swears on his name. He admits that Alan is a man worthy of being in Class A. The protagonist opened his eyes in surprise. What did he say? Godfin said, he heard it clearly. The protagonist sat down on the ground in surprise. Leo looked at him and unexpectedly extended his hand. He told Alan that starting tomorrow he would run with him in the mornings. MC, offering him his hand, replied that he didn't want that. Sometime later, Alan, limping from the battles, walked along, wondering what had happened. In a strange twist of events, he'd lost 2 trump cards, Perry and Leo. But still, staying in Class A was out of the question. When he entered the academy, Godfin addressed him and announced in front of everyone that along with Leo's recommendation, he'd received recommendations from all the students in Class A. Last night, he'd already received His Majesty's approval, and now he officially recognized Alan's enrollment in Class A. MC exclaimed in amazement. What? The old man chuckled and remarked, to achieve this in less than a day, what kind of magic did he use? The protagonist touched his head and said, this is a joke, right? At that moment, he heard a familiar chuckle, and looking at Fyun, he realized it was her doing. All his classmates, including the girl, looked at him with smiles. Fyun exclaimed, did he really think he could escape her? She'd pursue him to the very end, so he'd better give up. The protagonist looked at her with irritation. Aldor happily said, he's awesome. He fought so evenly with Leo, whose magical power exceeds 50,000. What kind of trick is this? The protagonist grimaced at his words. Jewelry addressed the protagonist, telling him her name and adding that if Fyun bothered him, he could ask her for advice anytime. Alan looked at her in surprise. Following the girl, Kate told him her name, adding that she was from the civil service course. She said, the whole class knows he's a D. The protagonist exclaimed in amazement, that can't be right. Stella said she was joining them on their morning run too. He could start rejoicing. The protagonist dejectedly asked her, who is she? The girl said, slightly irritated, she's Stella, and it's nice to meet him. Coconial also wanted to join the protagonist on their run. He promised to try not to be a burden. Alan replied with a downcast voice that he wasn't really against it. Dan asked Doru, so what? What time are they running tomorrow? Doru asked him back, where are they meeting tomorrow? Perry, who had just fully recovered, twisted his head around and shouted at the protagonist that of course he was running with him tomorrow too, and that he shouldn't forget it. Godfin laughed kindly and told the protagonist that he had won everyone over with just one poll. That was also the right path in politics. The protagonist glanced sheepishly at his classmates. Fyun called his name, extended her hand, and exclaimed, welcome to the Royal Academy's first A class. Everyone else murmured approvingly and welcomingly. Only Leo stood apart, not sharing the general joy. MC looked at him carefully. Even in the long history of the Royal Academy, the 1127th graduating class stands out for its achievements, leaving everyone far behind. They were dubbed the Unicorn Generation, and those who formed its core have left their names in history. Invincible Leo, the Void is the form of Faerun, the great Aldor waterfall, and Coconiel, a friend to all. They are spoken of as true geniuses. Alan is said to be the ace of the generation. That's the very first small legend about him. In just one day, he forced his outstanding classmates to recognize his worth, overturned an unfair decision, and secured admission to Class A.